your question was, you asked me to comment on the colonial arrangement post-independence. Very briefly, it was, you see, the oil was really what was there for the British, the oil and principally. And the oil being in the Niger Delta in the south, the strategy was how can we best get access to that resource most cost efficiently. And we all know that in life that if you have to negotiate a commercial deal with the direct owners of a resource, they're going to hold out for premium and market rates. But if you can do a deal with those who are not the direct owners of that resource, then you're likely to get it cheaper. Such that when it now came to, and in Fatherless, one of the most important lessons in Fatherless is the real reason for decolonization. You see, we're led to believe that, like the slave trade, it was a moral turnaround. The reality is that it was America, specifically Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who insisted on decolonization as a condition of America joining with Britain and France in the Second World War against Nazi Germany and its allies. And in Fatherless, I present the evidence to show that. The reason we didn't get independence in the 40s, i.e. immediately after the Second World War, was that Roosevelt died 2 weeks before the end of the Second World War. And when he died, the British were able to swing the American attention away from decolonization to the Cold War, because Russia had, by virtue of its contribution to the war effort, had actually reached as far as Berlin, if you recall. So the priority became to push the Russians back. So decolonization dropped off the table. It only came back onto the table, as I explained in Fatherless. It only came back onto the agenda on the back of the Vietnam War, because Churchill refused to commit British troops to help America in the Vietnam War, to come in with them, which is what the Americans were expecting. And then Eisenhower now decided to put his foot down and put the decolonization back on the agenda and insist on the empires going. So that's why independence for all these countries was coming in the 50s and in our case 1960. So because they did not want to leave, because they knew the oil was there in the quantities that we've been wasting since independence, logically, if we were in their if the roles were reversed and we were in their position, we would think how best to access that oil. And that then depends on who's going to control the country post-independence. And the partners that they had adopted and had been grooming, but simply fast-tracked it in the run-up to independence, was the Fulani and the Sokoto Caliphate, which is what explains why the Fulani, and Buhari in particular, are behaving with the impunity that they're behaving now. Because as I explained in Fatherless, they had been tipped off that when democracy fails, as it will, that it is those who control the guns and the police and security, and rather than those who have the PhDs, that will call the shots. So that's the answer to the colonial arrangement post-independence. What we've got is a direct product of what was designed pre-independence. Funshaw suggested that I might be infantilizing southern Nigeria. You couldn't be further from the reality and the truth. You see, we must not be, there's no room for pride in this thing. When the reality is, when you stop and think about it, if you're in paradise, the land of plenty, where is the struggle? What are you struggling for? If your land is bountiful, producing food for your sustenance, and your land is blessed by nature with wildebeest and whatever, meat in abundance, what are you struggling for? What are you killing your neighbor for? Is it more land? Contrast the winters of Europe, where many do not survive the winters. And if that winter is going to come, this is before central heating, before development, before the slave trade, etc. If those harsh winters are coming, and they come seasonally, you see, our weather is constant. It's either hot or wet and hot or dry. We don't really suffer from natural disasters. In these lands, the death rates were high by virtue of the hostile climate. And if it became a matter of your children making it through the winter, or your neighbor's children making it through the winter, and your neighbor has stored food and you don't have it, and your neighbor won't share, this is the genesis for conflict. And it's conflict that now produces, the greater the conflict, it now produces your fighting capability. If you've got nothing to fight for, where is your fighting experience and now it's going to come from? So let's not be emotional or sentimental about this thing. We did not write this. This is evidence that dropped out of their accounts. It was serving their purpose because they knew the truth. The lies about cannibalism, the lies about being an ungodly peoples, we must reject all of that. The reality is, there's a book that I recommend that doubters on this issue in terms of the impact of geography on development. It's by Jared Diamond, Professor Jared Diamond, titled Guns, Steel, and Germs. And it explains how geography, your location, your environment shapes the character of the peoples living in there. So it's not we're peaceful people are not infantile. Let's get that clear. We were peaceful, we were contented because we had plenty. That does not suggest that you're infantile. Your mind is actually creative because you're not devoting it to the struggle for daily survival. But what happens is that when those who are coming from that environment, are now thrown up against, suddenly encounter those ones who are coming from a very hostile environment with a long history of killing and improving the weapons of death. If we were, I put it to those who take the contrary view, if the narrative that we were always killing ourselves, we were always fighting ourselves, was true, either we were very poor fighters such that the British were able to take over, or the Europeans were able to take over as easily as they did, or the narrative is that we had no reason to suspect hostility or hostile conduct. And the same thing happened to I was lucky when I was writing my latest book, A Slave Ship Called Jesus. I was lucky to stumble into a translation of the diary of Christopher Columbus when he first landed in the Caribbean, specifically it was Haiti. And again, they were in the land of plenty. They had no reason to suspect hostility. And indeed, what they did in the first instance, they were very civil. I remember the late Chief Anthony Anahuru used to say to me, asked me very often, said, what was it that changed the Portuguese? Because when they first came to Benin, they were very civil. But then when they came back, they were hostile, aggressive, and took over. And I explained that the first trip, when you don't know your fighting capability of those whose land you're landing in, you do not pick a fight immediately. You observe, you're civil, you're respectful. But once you've assessed the weapons that they're using for warfare, and you know that your weapons are superior, when you come back again, then you're ready to unveil your true character. And yes, there were slaves in southern Nigeria. There's no denying that. But let's not confuse or allow ourselves to confuse the commercial slavery of the transatlantic slave trade with what was called slavery. It's a bit like the modern, when they talk now about they call it modern slavery. Yeah, they use that terminology, modern slavery, which is wholly inappropriate, because to use the term modern slavery to describe those who are low-waged or being exploited, they've been paid, to even use the word slavery in that context as an equivalence to what was happening in the transatlantic slave trade is an insult to the memory and the suffering of those who endured the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade. So similarly, let's not allow any equivalence whatsoever between slavery in inverted commas as it was in Africa, which was just more like house helps of modern day. Let's not confuse the two and allow the two to be confused. Rhodes Scholarship, yes, it was all the money that, the resources that Rhodes stole from the people of South Africa, the diamonds, etc., that was then used to fund what we now know as the Rhodes Scholarship. It makes a fundamental point that, you see, armed robbers can all be philanthropic once they've made the money. Once somebody with a AK-47 has robbed and accumulated the millions, he can be generous to his church, donate to charity, establish scholarships. This is the whole story of the slave trade, where you remember at the beginning of the Black Lives Matters demonstration over the George Floyd killing in Bristol. Bristol was a major center, slave imports, and there was a statue that was pushed down, the statue of a chap called Edward Colson. He made his money, a substantial part of his money, in the slave trade. And with those resources, he could be a benefactor right across the city of Bristol, to the point that statues are erected in his honor. In fact, until very recently, they used to, there was a church service that was staged in honor, on his birthday, in honor of his memory. So this is the background and the context for us to understand this Rhodes Scholarship. And yes, Goldie, if he had been left in place and made as much money as Rhodes, and he could have, because bear in mind the oil was discovered, as I explained in Fatherless, contrary to the lie oil was discovered in Nigeria in 1956. It was actually discovered in 1908. Exploration began in 1906. It was discovered in 1908, and by 1909, southern Nigeria was producing 2,000 barrels of oil per day. And so, yes, if Goldie had continued and made money in the same way as Rhodes did through his own charter company, potentially you will have seen gold scholarships being established in Goldie's name, being awarded to young Nigerians, etc., etc. Your third question was, did our leaders sell us out? Some did and compromised, but others were simply deposed. It was either you accepted the terms that Goldie and Co. were imposing on our people. So that's why you had the invasion of Benin, for example, and the invasion of Arachuku, the Arachuku War, the war against the Igbos, because they were not ready to accept terms. And so excuses for war had to be created. And as we touched on earlier as well, in the conquest of Sokoto, the attitude of the original Sokoto Caliphate leader was, between us and you, infidels, there can only be war. So they were not ready to sell out. But when the terms were not accepted, excuses for an invasion, such as what Lugard launched undercover, were then found. The land was invaded with the superior weaponry they were able to conquer, and replace the true leaders with the sellouts, and so this happened again and again.